A man is being nailed to wood on a low hill outside Jerusalem. It is a Friday morning in early spring. The hill is called Golgotha, which in Aramaic means the place of the skull. The crowd is thinner than you might expect for an execution. Most people are inside the city walls preparing for Passover. Out here, on this hill, you can hear hammers. You can hear a Roman centurion barking at his men in clipped Latin. You can smell dust and sweat and the iron tang of blood drying on a wooden beam. If you turn your head, you will see 3 crosses. The 2 on the outside hold thieves. The one in the middle holds a man named Jesus of Nazareth. It is just past 9 in the morning when you arrive at the hill. He will be on that cross for the next 6 hours. In those 6 hours, he will speak exactly 7 sentences. He will choose them one at a time, as his lungs collapse and the muscles in his back tear from the weight of holding his own body up. Each sentence will cost him air he does not have. Each sentence will be his last chance to say what he came here to say. That is the whole video. The 7 sentences, in the order he said them, and what each one meant in the language he actually said it in. Now, about the wood itself. The Jewish historian, Josephus, who served as a Roman commander before he switched sides and became their chronicler, wrote that during the siege of Jerusalem in the year 70, Roman soldiers crucified so many Jews trying to escape the city that they ran out of trees. Josephus says the soldiers nailed the bodies in different positions just to amuse themselves. Crucifixion was so common in the Roman world that the lawyer Cicero, for decades before Christ, called it the most cruel and disgusting penalty a human being could ever be given. The horror was normal. What he said on the wood was not. This is not a story about 7 Bible verses. This is not a story about a doctrine. This is not a story about a moment that ended a long time ago. This is a story about every sentence a dying man chose to speak with the last breaths he had, and what each one cost him to say. And here is something almost nobody catches the first time they hear these 7 sentences read out loud. There is a pattern hidden inside them. The very first word he says, and the very last word he says, are the same word. We will come back to that word, but not yet. For now, he has just been lifted up onto the beam. The pain is past anything you can picture, and the first sentence he chooses to speak is, the one nobody on that hill saw coming. His arms have just been pulled to full extension. The nails are driven into his wrists, not his palms. Roman crucifixion targets the carpal bones. Because the soft palm tears under body weight, he had been beaten the night before with a flagrum, a Roman whip with bits of bone and metal woven into the leather strips. His back is one open wound. The cross drops into its hole with a violence that almost dislocates his shoulders. This is the moment he chooses to speak. The first sentence anyone ever hears him say from that cross is not a curse on his enemies. It is not a prayer for rescue. It is not a final defense before the crowd. It is this: Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Stop and feel the weight of that. You were standing close enough to hear it. The men who drove the nails are 6 feet below him, casting lots for his clothes. The leaders who lied at his trial are watching from the edge of the hill. The crowd that screamed for his blood is right there at the front. And the first thing he uses his voice for is to ask his Father out loud to forgive them. Here's what most people miss. In the Greek, the verb they know is in the imperfect tense. It does not mean they did not know one time in the past. It means they keep on not knowing. They are not knowing right now. They are not knowing as the dice click against the stone. They are not knowing as the centurion shifts his weight on the ridge above them. He is forgiving them in the moment while they are doing it, while they do not even understand what they are doing it to. You have probably forgiven somebody in your life. Most of us have, eventually, but it is one thing to forgive somebody years after the wound has closed. It is a completely different thing to forgive somebody who is, in the exact second you forgive them, still hurting you. That is sentence number 1. Hours pass. He says nothing else. The sun climbs. The dust on the hill is heavy. The 2 men on either side of him have been mocking him the whole time. Matthew tells you that both of them, in the early hours, joined the crowd in insulting him. But somewhere in those long, slow hours, one of them stops. History does not record what changed his mind. Maybe it was the way Jesus did not curse the soldiers. Maybe it was the way he had asked his Father to forgive the people putting nails into his own body. Whatever it was, the thief on Jesus' right turns his head with whatever strength he has left. And he speaks. He says, in roughly these words, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. It is the smallest, faintest request in the entire Bible. A dying criminal asking another dying man to remember him in a kingdom neither of them can see. The traditional name early Christian writings preserve for this man is Dismas. He has nothing to offer Jesus and nothing to offer God. He has not been baptized. He is not given to the temple. He has done no good works. He is being executed for a reason. The Greek word the gospel uses for him, lestes, can mean thief, but it more often means a violent man, a bandit. And Jesus turns his head and answers, truly I tell you, Today you will be with me in paradise. That word, paradise, in Greek, is It comes from an old Persian word, paradisa, that means a walled royal garden. The Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures that Jesus and his disciples grew up reading, uses this exact same word to describe the Garden of Eden. So when Jesus tells the thief he is going to paradise, he is not saying he is going to some pleasant cloud somewhere. He is saying, today you come home. Today you walk back into the garden the first humans were exiled from. The first official citizen of heaven in the entire New Testament is a violent criminal who could only manage one sentence in his own defense. And his sentence was not a defense at all. It was a request to be remembered. There is no minimum requirement to come home. Dismas is the proof. The third sentence is not spoken to a crowd, or a thief, or a soldier. It is spoken to his mother at the foot of the cross. The Gospel of John tells us, for women are standing. Mary, his mother. Mary, the wife of a man named Mary Magdalene, and his mother's sister, 3 of them are named Mary. 2,000 years later, if you read those verses slowly, it is still one of the most quietly devastating details in the Gospels. His mother could not stand there alone. The women carried each other, and the only one of the 12 disciples present is John. The rest have run. Peter is somewhere weeping in a corner of the city. Judas is already dead. The others are hiding. Jesus looks down. You are watching her now. You are watching a Jewish woman, probably in her late 40s, watching her firstborn son die in a way that, if you are a parent, you cannot imagine surviving. She does not speak. She is past speaking. She is just watching. Then he says to her, woman, behold thy son. And to John he says, behold thy mother. The Greek word for woman here is gyne. It is not disrespectful. It is intimate but slightly formal. The kind of word you use for somebody you love when something between you is about to change forever. Jesus had used this word exactly once before in his entire public ministry. He used it at a wedding in Cana on the day he turned water into wine and his ministry began. Woman, he said then, my hour has not yet come. And now, 3 years later, on a Friday morning, on a hill outside Jerusalem, his hour has come. He looks down at the same woman. He calls her by the same word. The bookend was placed there on purpose. His own brothers are not at the cross. The Gospel of John tells us earlier, very plainly, that his brothers did not yet believe in him. Jewish law and custom said the eldest son was responsible for his widowed mother, so Jesus, with what he has left, gives that responsibility to John instead. And from that hour, John tells us he took her into his own home. 3 sayings down. Mercy for his killers. Paradise for a criminal. A home for his mother. There are 4 sentences left, and the next one is the one that will break you. Before we go any further, before the sky goes black at noon, and before the man on the middle cross says the sentence that has shaken Christians for 2,000 years. Pause with me for a second. You have heard 3 sayings so far. Mercy for the men driving the nails. Paradise for a thief who could barely speak. A home for the mother he was leaving behind. If this is the kind of Bible explanation you have been looking for, slow, careful, told like a real story instead of a lecture, hit subscribe. There are dozens of these coming. Every sentence, every figure, every detail most people read right past without ever noticing what is actually sitting there on the page. Then come back here, because what happens next, in the darkness, on this hill, is the moment the entire Bible has been building toward. Now watch what happens next. It is now noon. The sun should be directly overhead, the hottest point of the day, in Judea in early spring. But something is happening to the sky. The Gospel of Mark records it in 1 sentence. And when the 6th hour was come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. 3 hours. From 12 noon until 3 in the afternoon. The brightest part of the day went black across the entire region. Mark, who writes the shortest gospel and almost never adds atmospheric detail, stops to record this. Matthew confirms it. Luke confirms it. Whatever happened at noon on that Friday, it was visible enough and strange enough that 3 different writers, decades apart, all sat down and wrote it down. If you were standing on that hill, you would barely have been able to see him on the middle cross anymore. You would have heard the slow, ragged breathing of 3 men who were running out of air. You would have heard nothing else. For 3 hours, he says nothing. The crowd that had been mocking him grows quiet. The soldiers stop talking. The thieves on either side stop arguing. The hill goes still. Then, at the 9th hour, he cries out. He does not cry out in the Hebrew of the rabbis. He does not cry out in the Greek of the empire. He cries out in the Aramaic he grew up speaking in his mother's kitchen. Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. It means, my God, why have you forsaken me? You need to sit with that for a moment. For all of eternity past, the Son had never been separated from the Father, not for 1 second of one day. There is no scripture, no theology, no moment in all of recorded existence before this one, where the Son cried out and the Father did not answer. And now, on a Friday afternoon, on a hill outside Jerusalem, the line goes dead. If you have ever waited for an answer to a prayer that did not come, you have felt a faint shadow of what was happening to him in that moment. He is feeling it for everyone who ever has and everyone who ever will. The crowd, hearing the first sound, Eli thinks he is calling for the prophet Elijah. They are wrong. He is not calling for a prophet. He is asking his father a question that has no good answer. Some of them say, "Wait, let us see if Elijah will come to take him down." Nobody is coming. He is alone in a way no human being has ever been alone before or since. But it gets stranger. The sentence, "Jesus screamed from that cross," is not random. It is the first line of a psalm. Psalm 22, written by King David roughly 1,000 years before this Friday. My God, why hast thou forsaken me?" And here's the part you have to understand about a Jewish crowd in the first century. They did not memorize verses the way you and I do. They memorized whole psalms. When a rabbi spoke the first line of a psalm, his listeners mentally finished the rest of it in their own heads. Quoting the first line was a way of pointing to the whole thing. So when Jesus speaks the opening line of Psalm 22 to a Jewish crowd in their own native language, he is not just expressing despair. He is pointing them to a psalm that begins in forsakenness but ends in something else entirely. We will come back to how that psalm ends. Hold that dot, but for right now, on this hill, in this darkness, the only thing that matters is this: the God who never abandoned anyone, the God who walked with Adam in the garden, who appeared to Moses in the burning bush, who spoke to Elijah in a whisper that God, on this afternoon, turned his face away from his own son, and the son screamed. After the scream comes the quietest sentence in the entire crucifixion: I thirst. 2 words, 2 small, human, ordinary words. The God who made every river you have ever seen. The God who, the Gospel of John tells you, was there in the beginning when nothing was made that was made without him. The God who walked on water just 3 years before this afternoon. That God, on this cross, says, I thirst. John, the only disciple at the foot of the cross, watches this and writes decades later one of the most haunting parenthetical lines in the New Testament. He tells you that Jesus said this knowing that all things were now accomplished, that the scripture might be fulfilled. He says it on purpose, not as a complaint, not as a request for relief. He says it because it is what the prophets said he would say. Psalm 16, verse 21, For my thirst they gave me vinegar to drink. Somebody in the crowd, the gospel does not give you a name, picks up a sponge, soaks it in sour wine, and lifts it to his mouth on the end of a hyssop branch. Now here's the part nobody tells you. Hyssop is not a random plant. It is the same plant that, 1,400 years earlier, the Israelites in Egypt had used to paint the blood of the Passover lamb on their doorposts, so the angel of death would pass them by. That night in Egypt, every firstborn who was not behind blood died. Every firstborn behind blood lived. Now, on Passover Friday, on a hill outside Jerusalem, the firstborn of Mary, the firstborn of God, is on a wooden beam with his own blood already dripping down it. And what reaches him in his thirst is sour wine lifted on the end of a hyssop branch. The same plant, the same blood, the same day on the calendar, 1,400 years apart. He drinks, he swallows, he looks up. And then he says one word that, in Greek, was being written across receipts in marketplaces all over the Roman Empire while he was still walking the earth. The word is Tetelestai. In English, it takes 4 words to translate. In the King James, it takes 3. It is finished. But here is what Tetelestai actually meant to anybody in Jesus' world who could hear him say it. And if you understand nothing else from this video, understand this. The perfect passive indicative tense in Greek does something English cannot do cleanly. Describes an action completed in the past whose result keeps standing. Finished once, finished forever. And there is more. Archaeologists have pulled thousands of papyri from the markets of Egypt and Greece from this exact century. Receipts, invoices, tax records. On those receipts, scribbled across the top in ink, case after case after case. You see the word T. It meant paid in full, debt settled. Do not come back to collect. So when Jesus, on a Friday afternoon outside Jerusalem, looks up and says the one word the Gospel of John records, he is not saying, I give up. He is not saying, I am done suffering. He is not saying, I have failed. He is saying, paid in full. Tetelestai is not a sigh. Tetelestai is a victory cry. The debt that started in a garden 4,000 years before this Friday, paid in full. The debt of every commandment Israel ever broke, paid in full. The debt of every sin every human being ever committed and ever will commit, including yours, paid in full. And remember Psalm 20, the one he began screaming 3 hours ago. You could read the whole psalm at home tonight, but here's how it ends. After the forsakenness, after the bones out of joint, after the casting of lots for the garments, Psalm 22 ends with this line, they shall come, and shall declare his righteousness unto a people that shall be born, that he hath done it. That last phrase in Hebrew is ki, es, he has done it. Same idea as same victory. 1,000 years apart. Pay attention to this. Jesus was never just quoting the first line of that psalm. He was pointing to the whole thing. He was telling the Jewish crowd, from inside the darkness, the line that began in forsakenness ends in done. For them then, for you now, the bookend was always there. It is finished. One sentence left. He has been on that cross for almost 6 hours. The darkness has lifted. The crowd has thinned. His mother is being held up by the other women. John is standing close. He breathes in, and he says, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Now listen, this is where everything comes back. Do you remember? At the very beginning, when I told you there was a pattern hidden inside the 7 sentences, that the very first word he said and the very last word he said were the same word. Look at them side by side. The very first sentence began, Father, forgive them. The very last sentence begins, Father, into your hands. The 7 sayings sit inside a bracket. From the first nail to the final breath, the dying son was talking to his father. The father turned his face away in the middle. There was a moment when the line went dead, but the conversation began with Father, and the conversation ended with Father. The gospel writers preserved that frame on purpose. He never stopped talking to his father, not even when his father was not listening. But there is one more thing you need to hear. The sentence he chose for his last breath is a direct quote of Psalm 31, verse 5. And here is the part that has haunted believers for 2,000 years. Psalm 31, verse 5 was the bedtime prayer Jewish mothers taught their children to pray before going to sleep. Into thy hand I commit my spirit. Every Jewish boy in first-century Galilee was taught this prayer by his mother. Mary taught it to Jesus when he was small, kneeling on a dirt floor in Nazareth, before she blew out the lamp at night, the way maybe your own mother prayed over you, when you were too young to know what the words meant. And now, on a Friday afternoon outside Jerusalem, with his mother below him watching, he prays the prayer she taught him as a little boy. He goes to sleep in his father's hands. He dies praying his mother's bedtime prayer. There is a man you need to know about. His name was Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He was a German pastor arrested by the Nazis for plotting against Adolf Hitler. On the morning of April 9, 1945, in a camp called Flossenburg, they hanged him. The camp doctor who was there that morning wrote in his memoir, years later, that he watched Bonhoeffer kneel and pray before they walked him to the gallows. Bonhoeffer prayed Psalm 31, verse 5, Into thy hand I commit my spirit. The doctor wrote that he had hardly ever seen a man die so entirely composed, 2,000 years apart. The same sentence, the same hands, 7 sentences, in 6 hours, from one man on a wooden beam outside Jerusalem. Forgive, Paradise Woman, forsaken thirst. Father, before you close this video, 3 things to take with you. First, every sentence Jesus said on the cross was chosen on purpose. He had only minutes of voice left, and he used those minutes to forgive his enemies, save a thief, take care of his mother, bear the cost of a separation no one before him had ever borne, finish the work, and go home. Nothing on that hill was random. The 7 sayings were chosen by a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Second, if you've ever wondered whether God notices the smallest people, Dismas was the smallest person on that hill. A criminal nobody important would have named. A man with no good works, no baptism, no membership in any temple anywhere. He is the first one Jesus brings home. There is no minimum requirement. There never has been. And third, if you have ever lain awake at 3 in the morning feeling forsaken, feeling like the line has gone dead, feeling like the prayer you have been praying has been hitting the ceiling and falling back, he has been there. He has said the sentence. He went through it on a Friday afternoon outside Jerusalem, so that the next time you say those words at the ceiling, you are not the first one to say them. He went first. Which of the 7 sayings hit you the hardest? Tell me below. I read every single comment. 7 sentences, 6 hours, 1 son, paid in full.